This is the story of Shamgar, a simple and unlikely man whose destiny seemed limited to the hills and fields where he guided his village's oxen. Israel was under the rule of the Philistines, and the people lived oppressed, without hope, always fearing the next attack. Amid the anguish of a helpless people, Shamgar, son of Anath, stood out for his silent courage and persistent faith. He was never a warrior, nor was he prepared to lead, but God saw something different in his heart. Armed only with a goad, a humble instrument for driving cattle, Shamgar heard the divine call and, with the strength that came from faith, faced the enemies of his people, accomplishing the unexpected. Her story takes us on a journey of courage and dedication, reminding us that God's purpose can manifest itself where we least expect it and transform the life of anyone who has the courage to believe. At that time, when the people of Israel lived under constant oppression from the Philistines, in a small village hidden among the mountains of Ephraim, Shamgar was born, the son of a humble woman named Anath. The village was simple, with mud houses and thatched roofs, and life was hard work, but dignified. Shamgar was just another child in a settlement struggling to survive in such difficult times. Israel was under the rule of the Philistines, who plundered the crops, took what they wanted, and left the people in the deepest misery. Not a single day went by without someone losing something to invaders. From an early age, Shamgar heard, as if in whispers, stories of other times of great men and women who had guided Israel and done the impossible. He heard about Moses, who parted the sea for the people to cross, and about Joshua, who broke down the walls of Jericho with trumpets. And although they were stories full of glory and hope, to Shamgar they seemed distant, as if they belonged to a past that would never return. Shamgar grew up without any sign that his life was any different. Didn't have swords or shields like the warriors in his stories, only the goad he used to tend the oxen. Still, each time the Philistines attacked, the boy felt a mixture of anger and helplessness. Time passed, and Shamgar became a strong young man, dedicated to working in the field, alongside his mother, Anath, and the few animals they owned. He knew well the harshness of his daily life. Every day, right at sunrise, he went out with the oxen, guiding them with the goad, a long, sharp stick that he used deftly to keep them in the right direction. With each step, Shamgar felt the strength growing in his arms and calloused hands. But his heart seemed to carry a weight that work did not alleviate. With each dawn, the surrounding hills whispered of times of oppression. Shamgar saw the fear in the eyes of his mother and neighbors, who worried about the possibility of yet another Philistine attack, and on silent days, he walked through the village, listening to the cries and bitter stories of the people who always seemed to wonder where the God who once made them was. Will save them. But when night fell and the stars appeared over the mountains, terrifying, he still felt like there was something beyond the routine, a purpose that called to him, even if he didn't know from where. The village elders reminded him that God had always heard the cry of his people, and Shamgar listened with respect. However, I never dared to imagine that a simple young man from the countryside could be part of something so great. And yet, as he went about his daily tasks, that strange longing in his chest grew. One clear morning, while the sun was still stretching over the mountains, Shamgar felt something different. The air around him felt heavy, and an uneasy feeling took over his chest. He held the goad as always, guiding the oxen, but his thoughts were far from work. Something worried him deeply, an almost whispered voice that insisted on his heart. Shamgar stopped and looked at the fields and small hills that surrounded his village, feeling a tightness in his chest as he thought of how many times those same fields had been taken by the Philistines. And for the first time, he wondered why no one was taking action. He looked at the goad in his hands, that simple piece of wood and metal that he knew so well, and a strange idea crossed his mind. He had never used the goad for anything other than guiding the oxen, but at that moment, it looked like he was holding a weapon. Could this be a sign? And even if he were, like him, a simple peasant, Could he stand up to the warriors who terrorized his people? As the questions swirled through his mind, SHAMGAR realized that his heart was beating faster and that the voice that had previously been a whisper became clearer. "Get up," he seemed to say. "Protect your own." He felt a kind of heat spreading throughout his body, as if he was filled with an unknown courage. The wind blew around him, and SHAMGAR could almost swear that God was there, present in a way he had never experienced before. In the silence of that same morning, a scream echoed in the village, breaking the tranquility. SHAMGAR turned toward the sound and saw a cloud of dust rising on the horizon. They were the Philistines. The men were already advancing through the hills, with their weapons gleaming in the sun, and their fierce screams frightened the small town. Residents ran desperately, trying to hide or protect their families, but most knew there was no way to fight. SHAMGAR felt the blood pulsing in his veins, and the heat of that unknown courage took over him again. He held the goad tightly, his gaze fixed on the invaders. The Philistine warriors laughed when they saw a young man standing in the field, unarmed, waiting for them. To them, he was just another foolish peasant trying to resist. But for SHAMGAR, that moment was everything. Something inside him said this was his calling. Without thinking twice, he charged towards the group, sting with his fist, and in a few moments he was in their midst. One by one, the soldiers fell, surprised by the strength and speed with which SHAMGAR attacked them. He fought with a fury and precision that he himself was unaware of, and with each blow, a new wave of courage came over him. The Philistines, overcome by terror, retreated, but SHAMGAR continued to fight them to the last man. When silence finally returned to the field, 600 warriors lay on the ground around him, and the people looked at him in amazement and admiration. While the countryside was still silent, the village elders began to approach, still stunned by what they had just witnessed. SHAMGAR, the young peasant, simple and unknown, had single-handedly defeated an army of 600 Philistines with just the goad he used to work with oxen. The villagers' faces were filled with astonishment and gratitude. For them, it could only be the work of God. One of the elders, his voice trembling, reached out his hand and said, "The Lord has used you, SHAMGAR. You are our hope." But SHAMGAR looked at the ground, not knowing what to answer. The words of praise and recognition sounded distant to him, who still felt the weight of the battle in his arms and the mixture of fear and amazement in his heart. He had never imagined being seen as anything other than a field worker, and now the people around him talked about him being God's envoy, a judge for the people. SHAMGAR felt that that moment changed something profound in his destiny, but he still resisted inside, asking himself why God would choose someone so ordinary for such a great mission. A judge, he thought, looking at the anxious faces of the villagers. He wanted to refuse, to walk away, to deny what everyone seemed to see in him, but the memories of the courage he had felt and the strength that had taken him in battle made him question whether, perhaps, this was not the path that God had chosen for him. In the nights following the battle, SHAMGAR could barely sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the warriors he had faced. He felt the weight of the goad in his hands and heard the echo of the screams he uttered in the heat of the fight. The village already saw him as a hero, a leader chosen by God, but within himself, SHAMGAR still felt like a simple peasant, lost and insecure. He wondered how he could protect his people against the powerful Philistine army and why the Lord would choose him for this mission. He was young and did not have the knowledge of the great leaders he had heard so much about in stories. One night, determined to seek answers, SHAMGAR left the house in silence and walked to a lonely field where he knelt and looked up at the starry sky. He felt small in the face of the greatness of God and the challenges that lay ahead. In a low voice, almost a whisper, SHAMGAR prayed, "Lord, I am just a man. How can I lead your people?" The words escaped his lips, filled with anguish and doubt. However, amid the silence of the night, a peace began to come over him, as if God himself answered him in a soft whisper, assuring him that he would be by his side. That morning, Shamgar returned home with a little lighter heart. He didn't have all the answers, but he felt that while trust in God, he would show you the way. And with that, Shamgar took the sting again with a new conviction, willing to face whatever came his way. The days of peace were short. Soon, news arrived that a new group of Philistines was on their way, prepared to plunder again. This time, however, Shamgar did not wait until they reached the village. He already knew what he needed to do. He gathered together the few men in the village, farmers like him, armed only with farm tools and a little courage. To them, Shamgar explained that it was not just a question of strength, but of strategy. They were not warriors, but they knew those mountains like no one else, every curve and every hidden trail. And if they used that knowledge, they would have a chance. With unexpected calm, Shamgar led the men to a narrow mountain pass through which the Philistines would surely pass. There they waited, hidden among the rocks and bushes, ready to surprise the enemy. Everyone's heart was beating fast, but Shamgar kept his gaze steady, the goad in his hands, determined. As the Philistines began to cross the pass, he gave the signal, and the men of the village jumped out of the shadows with shouts that echoed off the rocks, taking the soldiers by surprise. The fighting was swift and fierce, and the Philistines, taken by surprise and with no room to defend themselves, were defeated. For the first time, these common men tasted victory. At the end of the battle, Shamgar looked at the men around him, exhausted but full of pride. Something inside him told him there would be more fights, and he would need to be ready to lead them again. Over time, Shamgar became more than just a hero to the village. He was now a leader, a figure of hope to all who heard of his victories against the Philistines. With each confrontation, his fame spread among other villages, and men came from far and wide to fight alongside him, inspired by the courage of someone who, like them, knew the harsh life of the countryside. Shamgar, however, maintained the same simplicity. He did not see himself as a great commander. In his heart, he continued to be the young ox herder who only wielded a goad. The villagers, however, did not hide their pride. "Shamgar is our strength," they said, believing that God had, in fact, chosen him to protect them. At each meeting with his men, he reminded them that they were fighting not just for their lives, but for the future of their families and their faith in something greater. On silent nights, when they gathered around the fires after a day of training, Shamgar shared with them stories of Israel's ancient leaders, always emphasizing that true strength came not from the weapon in their hands, but from trust in the God of Israel. The people's confidence grew and hope began to flourish again. And although he accepted his responsibility, Shamgar did not forget that the battle was not just against the Philistines. There were other forces at play, including the fears and doubts that arose even among his own men. He knew that to maintain the people's faith, he would need to fight not only against the external enemy, but also against the insecurity that could arise at any moment. Despite the victories they won, not everyone in the people of Israel fully trusted Shamgar. Among the elders and some leaders of the neighboring villages, there were those who murmured about his leadership. They questioned how a man with no military training, no lineage of warriors, or any experience with weapons could truly be chosen by God. Shamgar listened to the doubts in silence, but in his heart, these words hurt him. After all, he himself has questioned why the Lord would choose him for such a difficult calling. Criticism began to spread among the villagers, some asking if they were putting too much trust in someone who was nothing more than a peasant. Shamgar, however, remained firm, seeking strength in his prayers and renewing his trust in the God of Israel. He knew that if he let these voices influence his heart, he could lose focus, and with it, his ability to protect his people. To deal with the situation, Shamgar began to get even closer to the men fighting at his side. In each conversation, he reminded the warriors that it was not physical strength that sustained them, but faith in purpose that guided them. And little by little, as they saw his unwavering determination, even those who had previously questioned him began to see something deeper. There was a genuine conviction and courage that could not be ignored. SHAMGAR, without deviating from his path, saw that God was strengthening not only his own faith, but also that of the men around him, preparing them for something even greater. As confidence in SHAMGAR grew among the Israelites, the Philistines began to realize that they were not just facing a makeshift leader, but someone whose faith inspired a whole people. Determined to undermine this influence, the Philistines spread rumors and superstitions among the Israelite villages. They whispered that SHAMGAR could only win because he was under some spell, or that his sting was a cursed weapon. They even said that the Philistine gods were enraged and that they would avenge each defeat with even greater force. These lies and threats gradually created doubts among the Israelites. Some began to avoid SHAMGAR, fearing that he would bring a curse on their families. SHAMGAR's old insecurities returned, but he knew he needed to confront these superstitions. He went from village to village, talking to people, talking not about himself, but about the power of the God of Israel. He reminded the people that their victories came from the one true God, who had promised to free Israel, and not from charms or curses. With a firm voice, he declared that he did not need amulets, just faith in the God who had heard the cry of his people. And in every village, the people listened to him, realizing that there were no tricks, just an unshakable trust that inspired courage. Thus, SHAMGAR dispelled the lies of the Philistines, and in return, further strengthened the bond between himself and his people. The news that a large Philistine army was marching towards the village came with the wind, leaving the people apprehensive. The scouts reported that it was the largest contingent of soldiers they had ever seen, heavily armed and determined to put an end to any resistance once and for all. SHAMGAR, however, did not back down. He gathered the men together and looked into each one's eyes, seeing fear mixed with courage. I knew that many were simple shepherds and farmers, but there, at that moment, they were warriors of faith. "Today we will fight not only for our lives," said SHAMGAR, his voice firm, "but for the freedom that God promised our people." The men raised the improvised tools as weapons, inspired by SHAMGAR's strength. With goad in hand and trust in his heart, he led his men to a strategic elevation where they could see the approaching army like a dark wave of destruction. When the Philistines advanced, SHAMGAR gave the first war cry and ran ahead without hesitation. The Israelites followed him with the same intensity, attacking with everything they had. The clash between the two groups was deafening, and the battle spread across the field like wildfire, with screams, clamors, and the sound of furious footsteps. SHAMGAR fought as if he had the strength of an army, guiding his men and inspiring them to resist until the end. The Philistines, surprised by the strength and determination of a people they had previously considered submissive, began to retreat. When silence finally took over the field, the Israelites saw their enemy defeated and fallen. SHAMGAR, exhausted, looked at the horizon, knowing that once again God was by his side, guiding them to victory. After that last and great battle, peace finally reigned over the land of Israel. The Philistines, once so feared, now hesitated to approach the villages that, under the leadership of SHAMGAR, had resisted with unexpected strength. The people came to see him as a true liberator, a judge chosen by God to guide and protect. SHAMGAR, however, remained faithful to his simplicity. He never sought honor or glory. His heart remained humble, and for him, everything he did was out of love for his people and out of obedience to the God who guided him. Over time, SHAMGAR left the battlefields and returned to his life in the field without ever claiming any special position or privilege. Villagers still looked to him, seeking advice or just wanting to be in the presence of the one who was a source of hope and courage. Each of SHAMGAR's visits to the villages was a special moment, as he was a rare leader who knew the people's suffering and spoke with the wisdom of someone who had intensely lived God's purpose. Thus, Shamgar's name began to be told among generations, a legend that inspired faith and courage. It is not known exactly how he spent his last days. There are those who say that he lived as he began, guiding the oxen with his faithful goad, and there are those who believe that he simply disappeared, taken by the God he served so much. What remained, however, was a profound example that God can use anyone, even the humblest of men, to perform great works in his name. Shamgar's story ends as it began, with simplicity and faith. An ordinary man without glory or riches, Shamgar was remembered not for the clothes he wore, nor for a position of power, but for the sting in his hands and the faith in his heart. Shamgar's example teaches that, in God's eyes, true greatness is not in titles or extraordinary abilities, but in the courage to respond to the call, even when everything seems impossible. He shows us that God sees value where the world does not, that he can transform anyone into a powerful instrument, as long as there is a willingness to obey. Shamgar never hid behind excuses about his lack of experience or knowledge. He was not a soldier, nor did he have weapons of war, but he believed that with God, what he had in his hands would be enough. In his story, we see that God uses even what appears to be small, a man with a goad, to accomplish great things. And it is this simple but unshakable confidence that brings inspiration. Shamgar's life calls us to reflect on our own journey, on how we face our challenges and where we draw our strength. He was someone who, despite his limitations, did not hesitate to protect his people and fight for what he believed in. Her story is a reminder that what we are and what we have is enough in God's hands. Shamgar inspires us to believe that within each of us there is the ability to make a real difference, as long as we have the faith and courage to move forward, even when the path seems uncertain. If you liked Shamgar's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.